we told you a little bit live, a ceremony today at the Kennedy Space Center where the remains of the 7 shuttle astronauts will be returned to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. These are the live pictures right now. As you can see, there are 7 hearses right there carrying the remains in a coffin of each of the 7
convoy
astronauts.
Transporting the Challenger
This is
crew
NASA
from the
narration.
Life
Let's just
Sciences
listen in
facility
here
on
to
Cape
see what they're
Canaveral Air
saying.
Force Station to the shuttle landing facility has just come into view as it proceeds up Kennedy Parkway. At the shuttle landing facility, each vehicle will be met by an astronaut escort who will accompany the remains throughout the transfer to the C-141 aircraft and the flight to Dover Air Force Base, Delaware. Astronaut escorts are Dan Brandenstein, Jim Buckley, Norm Thagard, Charles Bolden, Tammy Jernigan, Dick Richards, and Lauren Schreiber. At the shuttle landing facility, a small group of dignitaries wait to pay their respects. The official party includes Kennedy Space Center Director Richard Smith, who has been joined by Rear Admiral Richard Truly, Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, and representatives of all of NASA's field centers. Other invited guests include Colonel Jerry Sinclair, representing the Eastern Space and Missile Center, Dr. Walter C. Williams, Special Assistant to the NASA Administrator, George Abbey, Director of Flight Crew Operations at the Johnson Space Center, John Young, Chief of the Astronaut Office, and Dr. L.E. McHenry, Brevard County Medical Examiner. As the convoy passed through the industrial areas of the Kennedy Space Center, hundreds of NASA civil service and contractor workers lined the roadways to pay their respects to the crew of Challenger.
Again, what we were listening to there was Hugh Harris, the NASA spokesman, describing what you're seeing right here. This is the 7 hearses carrying the remains of the 7 Challenger astronauts who were killed in that fatal flight. On January 28th, their remains will be returned to Dover, Delaware, to the Air Force Base there, where they will be returned to their respective families. Some of them reportedly will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and others will have funeral services and private services, not at Arlington National Cemetery. The hearses will eventually be on the runway where the Challenger would have actually landed after its flight, the 3-mile runway. From there, it will proceed to C-141 transport plane, Air Force plane, and then on to Dover, Delaware, for the return to the respective families. And we will have further coverage of the events at the Kennedy Space Center coming up in about 10 minutes in the next hour of daybreak.
NASA is preparing to fly the remains of the 7 Challenger astronauts to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware and the final burial preparations. Good morning, I'm Reed Collins. We are now at the Kennedy Space Center near the 15,000-foot runway that the Challenger would have landed on after its mission that began and ended so suddenly and tragically back on the 28th of January. It is a different leave taking this morning, the remains of the 7 Challenger astronauts being taken by military escort to a C-141 plane that will fly up the eastern seaboard from the Kennedy Space Center to Dover, Delaware, to the Air Force Base there. The final mortuary preparations, after which the bodies will be released to the families, some of them probably to be interred finally at Arlington National Cemetery, across another shorter body of water, the Potomac River, from Washington, D.C. It is a bright morning, very similar to that of 3 months ago, when it all began with so much promise and ended so tragically. This technological feat that had worked so many times, but not that time. We're reminded as here the slow process, the dignified preparations continue There are other processes also connected to man's struggle with his technology in the Soviet Ukraine, where Lord only knows how many similar scenes are to be reenacted. A Soviet nuclear reactor apparently still on fire. The Russians have asked for assistance, technical assistance and advice into how to put it out. These scenes here are American scenes. These are Americans' flags that drape each of the caskets as it is borne on its way to the waiting plane. It will make that long shuttle voyage up the Atlantic seaboard to Dover, Delaware. As is the case with military, each remain will have an accompaniment. For Scobee, the pilot Norman Thagard will be the accompanist on the trip northward. Richard Richards will be the guard for the co-pilot Michael Smith. Charles Bolden will accompany the remains of Ronald McNair. Tamara Jernigan for Judith Resnik. Lawrence Shriver will be the accompanist for Ellison Onizuka. Dan Brandenstein will be the escort for the body of Gregory Jarvis. James Buckley will accompany the remains of Christa McAuliffe on the flight north. Earlier, there was a procession over from the hangar at the Air Force test site where the remains were gathered before they were taken here to the long concrete apronway. A procession that reminded many observers long of the scene of astronauts being taken out to one of the launch pads, except this one was much slower, much different. It was a procession of 7 hearses coming along one of those broad areaways. As we see, there is an honor guard, there's the NASA flag, there is the United States emblem. Through this cordon of honor, each of the caskets is borne by 4 military pallbearers and followed by the permanent escorts, which we name for you. It's spring, and you can hear its little piping accompaniment in the background. This trip northward takes a couple of hours. Several other people have been invited here. There are representatives of all of NASA's agencies here and representatives of all the space centers, the Johnson Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center. Everybody sent somebody because everybody was, of course, heartfeltly involved. See Walt Williams there, now an advisor to NASA, one of the first men who put the first man for this country into space. That's Tamara Jernigan following the casket with the remains of Judith Resnik. There's only a dim outline of a plan for all of this because there was no plan for any of this. And no clock is whickering away the milliseconds, because time really doesn't matter here. All of the services, as well as civilian men, each in their own way, paying a last respect. You may have known there have been varying ideas about what should be done. Should it be a burial and a memorial at Arlington, or should the individual wishes of individual families override? And the final epilogic story to this is yet to be written. We hear the hollow speakers that have told the News Corps and the guests at the Vehicle Assembly Building what was going to happen next, now explaining what the order of this sad day is. The high shot, the overhead scene we see is taken from the top of the Vehicle Assembly Building, the largest in volume ever built as man began his first essays into the ocean of space. Now the birds pipe a little song as these oceanic sailors are home from the sea. Seven tender, sad tasks to be accomplished here. The recovery efforts a testimony also to the regard with which Western man holds the vessel that contains the soul. That metallic click of scores of shutters competing with the chirp of the birds here at the Kennedy Space Center's long landing strip. This geometric design, something that was never in the plan. Hearses are making their way away, as we see. Burdens delivered, job ended. It's left now for someone to give the command to the color guard. And so Francis, Dick Scobee, Michael Smith, Judith Resnik, Ellison, Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe. Names on coffins that are all now aboard a C-141, which will prepare to make its way out of the Florida sun and on up to the Air Force Base at Dover, Delaware, which has been the receiving station for so much of this country's grief, past and recent. Color Guard forms up to make its way down that rank of civilians and military. And the pallbearer guard reemerges from beneath the tail of the 141. Pilot is winding up the engines. There's no civilian traffic out of here. In fact, there's no traffic at the Kennedy Space Center to speak of. It hasn't been now for 3 months, except the coming and going of a few plane loads of investigators, many of whom come into Patrick Air Force Base, some 12 miles south of here. NASA still goes by the book. Shuttle transportation system with its flight designation, known to the world and most of us as simply the Challenger mission. And that pilot who's filed such a simple, routine flight plan. This moment does have some redemptive quality to it, certainly to the Navy people who spent so many weeks out in what were at rough times, rough seas, devoting themselves to making this moment a possibility and take some deep satisfaction in their job. Well done. Sad though it was. For the rest, there is no particular timing element of criticality here. There is a flight plan file that is to be followed. But nothing in conjunction with the equatorial crossing, launching of sub-satellites at the nodes of the equator on time. None of that. Just a long funereal flight up the coastline, back into Dover. When the front door is closed, the rear hatch has been secured. And very shortly, the bird that is made to fly only in this ocean of air will be taking off once everyone has gotten off board who's not supposed to be on the plane. Simple, uncomplicated. These tasks preparatory to takeoff. If for any reason you just have joined us, we have been witnessing the leave-taking of the remains of the 7 Challenger astronauts who in flag-draped coffins were brought here to the Kennedy Space Center landing strip, the long concrete runway that lies in the morning shadow of the vehicle assembly building, and the shuttles, their rockets, propulsion systems are assembled, brought over from the hangar area over on the Cape proper, brought to this place. This was the scene a few moments ago as 4 pallbearers carried each casket one by one from the hearse to the aircraft, followed by the permanent escort, each of the 7 bodies having been assigned a permanent escort to Dover Air Force Base and beyond, as is the military wont. It is not desired, nor is it proper, that one go home alone. Seven times this scene repeated. 7 times the salute of the military, the planners, and the programmers. And now it is all done and in the space of about half an hour, half an orbit of the Earth, the Kennedy Space Center has said farewell to the Challenger 7. Just almost 3 months to the day, had climbed aboard the shuttle. An aircraft obvious to the eye that can carry much, much more than the precious cargo it's being asked to bear northward this morning. What we've just seen is not truly a formal ceremony. One wasn't really planned. And the same procedure is to be followed at arrival time in Dover, Delaware, about noon Eastern time. About 2.5 hours from now. Richard Truly, who is a rear admiral and who now heads the shuttle program, along with the chief astronaut, John Young, and George Abbey, director of the flight crew operations over at the Johnson Space Flight Center, are accompanying the Challenger remains up to Delaware. For John Young, this takeoff will be a very familiar scene. It was he who flew most of the shuttle trainer weather surveys during launch days that shuttles passed here. The shuttle training vehicle, made to fall like a rock, similar at least to the glide ratio of the shuttle coming down. He would take it off and land it here time and time and time again, and take the shuttle trainer up into that arena of air through which a shuttle was going to pass. Check the weather aloft and check the landing conditions here on ground. Now he finds himself just about to do something far different. Take off one more time from the Kennedy Space Center strip. As we've noticed, there's hardly any air traffic in this vicinity, and none on the runway, which is really one vast apron of concrete, some 15,000 feet in length. If you land one way, it's called runway one number, and if you go the other way, then it's runway another number. There we get the longer view. With scrub and mangrove swamps about what is really a wildlife refuge here, teeming with life. White egrets fly across the snouts of alligators in their Renaissance life, having been protected for so many years. Occasional armadillo makes his little armored way across the roadways and the byways. Fox live out in the mangrove swamp. There's small Florida deer, a few of them are here. A place that teems with life, but not on this day. And so we have first motion as the pilot slides the 141 forward. And we see that little gaggle of photographers and onlookers out by the shuttle buses that brought them out on the concrete apron. And they strain to get a last view while it makes a right on the ramp. There's traffic in the area, of course. There's Tycho field over by Titusville, not far from here. There's Patrick Air Force Base, as we say, about 15 miles south of here. There's all the Orlando incoming, outgoing traffic inland. And we see a little crosswind this morning. Windsock indicates. As he pushes all four of them forward. Rotate.
A sad chapter of the space program is coming to an end. The remains of the Challenger astronauts were flown to Delaware today to be prepared for burial. Their caskets were loaded onto a plane at Kennedy Space Center this morning, as CNN's Mark Wolf reports.
The 7 astronauts killed in the Shuttle Challenger accident began a journey homeward today. A cortege of 7 hearses brought their bodies in flag-draped coffins to the airstrip at Cape Canaveral, who had expected to land. It was a solemn procession, but the cortege was met without ceremony. NASA officials, a military honor guard, and escorts from the astronauts' corps stood by the waiting aircraft. The remains of the astronauts were brought from the medical laboratory where autopsies had been performed. They are being flown to the Dover mortuary in Delaware. There, according to a NASA spokesman, they will be prepared in accordance with the wishes of the families. At Dover, the mortuary work should take about a day. Then the remains will be sent wherever the families decide. Officials said Navy Commander Michael J. Smith, the shuttle pilot, will be buried Saturday in Arlington National Cemetery with full Navy honors. Spacecraft Commander Francis Dick Scobee will be interred at Arlington on May 19th, which would have been his 47th birthday. The family of Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka wants his body returned to his home in Hawaii for burial. Interment plans for the others have not been announced. Killed in the shuttle explosion January 28th were Scobee, Smith, Onizuka, specialists Judith Resnik and Ronald McNair, engineer Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe, a New Hampshire schoolteacher. 7 astronauts are accompanying their fallen comrades on the flight to Dover. And the head of the shuttle program, Rear Admiral Richard Truly, was expected to be with them as well. Mark Wolf, CNN.
And briefly, exactly 13 weeks ago, after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, NASA officials have called off the search for more pieces of the shuttle's booster rockets. They did find a piece identified as the bottom half of the burn-through joint on the right booster rocket. The remains of the 7 shuttle astronauts were flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware today. The remains will be prepared for burial or cremation and then turned over to the astronauts' families. And briefly, Exactly 13 weeks ago, after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, NASA officials have called off the search for more pieces of the shuttle's booster rockets. They did find a piece identified as the bottom half of the burned-through joint on the right booster rocket. The remains of the 7 shuttle astronauts were flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware today. The remains will be prepared for burial or cremation and then turned over to the astronauts' families.